Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I want to give you my thoughts on the new Space Marine Codex. First off, I want to say that in this video I won't be going over chapter specific supplements in full, and instead in this video I will be focusing on the main codex first, with only a little bit of information from the two currently released supplements as needed to make sense of a few things. Reason for this is, Games Workshop wasn't lying in their preview when they said that these chapters are now going to have different playstyles from each other, making them pretty much their own armies. So because of this, I'm going to cover each chapter individually in their own separate videos. So after this video, you can expect to see an Ultramarine video, a White Scars video, and then when the other supplements are released, I will make videos on those chapters as well. And another thing I want to mention before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this video is that I will be looking at this book from the perspective of a competitive Warhammer 40k player, since that's what I enjoy doing and it's what I'm best at. So my thoughts won't be based around lore or any themes or anything like that. I'm just going to be giving my thoughts on what I think will be viable for competitive play. So with that said, let's get started. So first off, let's go over my first impressions of this new book. After reading through the Codex, I discovered that I really like this book, and I mean I really like it. I like the idea of one main Codex and then supplements for each chapter. I think it really helps flesh out these chapters and make them stand on their own 2 feet as their own army with their own identity, instead of just being Ultramarine clones like we've seen in the past in high-level competitive play. I also like all the options we have in this book, and the addition of successor chapters. I think it's really cool that you can now make rules for your own custom chapters, and I also think it's cool that the way you can do so has the potential to provide the meta with some unique and interesting combinations that can actually be very strong. So it opens up possibilities and more variety in Space Marine lists so that you can play your army the way you envisioned it based on your own unit preferences and your playstyle, at least for the most part. Another thing that I think about this codex is that Games Workshop seems to be pushing for mono codex armies as well with the addition of the new combat doctrines, and pushing for mono-faction armies with the addition of unique chapter doctrines. So to explain how this works without going too much into it, since I'll end up going over it in depth later on in this video, Space Marine chapters in this book gain access to combat doctrines as long as every unit in the army has the Angels of Death ability, which is a new rule found in this codex, and every unit in this codex has that rule. This means you can mix and match all the chapters from this book and still gain access to those combat doctrines, which incentivizes playing a mono codex army, so Space Marine soup essentially instead of Imperium soup. But they go a step further and also added chapter doctrines in the supplements, and you can only gain the benefit of your chapter doctrine if every unit in your army is from that chapter, or if they are a successor chapter of that chapter. For example, an Ultramarine successor chapter would also benefit from the Ultramarine chapter doctrine, as long as the entire army is either Ultramarine or the Ultramarine successor chapter, or a combination of both. So this incentivizes either playing a mono chapter army, so like pure Ultramarines, or making a list that mixes and matches chapters with successor chapters. I really like that Games Workshop decided to go about incentivizing mono armies this way, instead of the way the community has previously suggested the Games Workshop, because the way that they've done it is great in my opinion. It allows Imperium soup players to still soup up with Marines if they want to, while not hindering themselves too hard, but it also makes the pure Marine players happy, since their army can be quite strong even when played on its own. So I think the way Games Workshop did it will make both soup players and mono-faction players very happy. So with that said, you might be wondering where I personally stand on whether or not it would be more optimal to play Imperium soup or pure Space Marines. And I think there really isn't a definitive answer to that, which is a good thing. I think it could be viable to do both, because I personally think an Ultramarines list that is built around their chapter doctrine could be incredibly strong, but I also think mixing Ultramarines with Imperial Guard or even an Imperial Knight or two could also be incredibly strong. It really just depends on your build and what you're going for. Soup gives the benefit of being able to mix and match units from multiple codexes so that you can cherry pick the best ones for each of those roles needed to make a competitive army, while also covering each other's weaknesses. But the chapter doctrines seem like they are strong enough to build a pure Marine army and it still be viable, especially the Ultramarine chapter doctrine. I personally believe that the Ultramarines doctrine is definitely strong enough to warrant building a pure Ultramarine army for competitive play. So in my opinion, I guess it comes down to if you want to build a pure Space Marine army around your chapter doctrine or the generic doctrines, or do you want the benefits of cherry picking the best units from multiple books? And to be honest, I think both of those are great options and definitely something to consider when you're making your own list. So in theory, soup players and mono codex players and mono faction players get a little something from this update. But that's enough about my overall thoughts about the Codex and changes it comes with. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this video, and let's talk about some of the units and rules that I think stand out the most, and the ones that I think will be strong in every Space Marine army despite the chapter. So to start off, let's go over the brand new Angels of Death rule, which every unit in this codex has. So Angels of Death actually consists of 4 different rules called And They Shall Know No Fear, Bolter Discipline, Shock Assault, and Combat Doctrines. I assume they did this just to make datasheets more clean, instead of listing those 4 abilities on every datasheet, which would take up a lot of room. So I assume Games Workshop just opted to throw all of these rules within the Angel of Death rule, so that they only have to put Angels of Death on each datasheet, which allows more space for unique rules. So let's talk about those rules that make up the Angels of Death rule. And They Shall Know No Fear is the exact same as it was before the update. It allows you to re-roll a failed morale test. Bolter Discipline is also the same as before the update, allowing for new ways to trigger rapid fire on your rapid fire bolt weapons. So stuff like bolt rifles, bolt guns, basically anything with bolt in its name that is the rapid fire type weapon. And this also includes certain relics as well, which are specifically mentioned in the Codex on page 166. The rule Shock Assault is a new rule with this codex that gives +1 attack to models when they charge, get charged, or heroically intervene, meaning that Space Marines get extra attacks when they meet those requirements. And then we have the new Combat Doctrine ability, and this ability has 3 parts: the Devastator Doctrine, Tactical Doctrine, and Assault Doctrine. Your army always starts the game in Devastator Doctrine. When a doctrine is in play, it remains in play for the entire game unless you change it to another doctrine. So for example, because you start in Devastator Doctrine, you could choose to remain using the Devastator Doctrine all game long if you really wanted to, although I don't recommend it. At the beginning of each of your turns, you can naturally change your doctrine for free to the next doctrine. So the normal order is going from Devastator Doctrine, changing it to Tactical Doctrine, and then in the following turn you can change it to the Assault Doctrine. So when you change the Devastator Doctrine the normal way, you must change it to the Tactical Doctrine, and when you change the Tactical Doctrine, you must change it to the Assault Doctrine. And once you're in the Assault Doctrine, there is no normal way to go back to the other doctrines. At this point, you'll have to use Stratagems in order to go backwards to the other doctrines if you wish to do so. And the only stratagem that I've found that allows you to go backwards, it literally goes backwards. So you would reverse the order. You'd go from Assault Doctrine to Tactical Doctrine, and from Tactical Doctrine to Devastator Doctrine. So you use the normal means to go forwards, and you use the stratagem to go backwards. So for what these doctrines actually do, the Devastator Doctrine gives an extra -1 AP to all of your heavy weapons. So last cannons become AP -4, missile launchers become AP -3, etc. The Tactical Doctrine gives an extra -1 AP to rapid fire and assault weapons. So for example, bolt guns become -1 AP and bolt rifles become -2 AP. And the Assault Doctrine gives -1 AP to all close combat weapons, meaning chainswords become -1 AP and thunderhammers become -4 AP, and etc. So this mechanic is very interesting, and I think it will help showcase skill through decision making with Space Marine players, since they will have to figure out which doctrine is going to be the best for them at any given time. Personally, I think just following the natural order is the way to go in most matchups. Use the Devastator Doctrine on turn 1 to get some damage off with your heavy weapons from across the board, then turn 2 switch over to the Tactical Doctrine and annihilate some screening units, then on turn 3 and 4 switch to the Assault Doctrine and get in there and break some heads in melee combat, since Primaris Marines are now pretty brutal in combat with all the attacks they get from either being veterans, through a stratagem upgrade, and then also the new Shock Assault rule, which gives an extra attack per model when they charge, get charged, or heroically intervene. And yes, punching people with your fists in close combat will still receive the -1 AP from the Assault Doctrine, since it's still a melee weapon. In the past, Games Workshop made an errata or an FAQ that stated that all units come with a melee profile called Close Combat Weapon, and that profile is Strength User, 0 AP, 1 damage. So when your Intercessors, or really anything, is in close combat and they are using that profile, then that weapon gains an extra -1 AP through the Assault Doctrine. So other than following the natural order of the game, you can also stick to whatever doctrine you need at the time. So if you're playing against Imperial Guard and they are spamming a bunch of tanks and infantry, then stick to the Devastator Doctrine to ensure that you kill those tanks from afar, while your Intercessors clear up the infantry, since they don't really need that extra AP to kill a ton of Guard infantry anyways. Or if you're against an army like Chaos Demons, the extra AP from the Doctrines won't really matter all that much, since Demons really only have invulnerable saves, which don't care about AP modifiers, so that extra AP from the Doctrines won't really matter anyways. So in this case, I'd stick to the doctrine that coincides with your chapter doctrine, so that you at least benefit from the ability your chapter doctrine gives. With that said, I'll go more into chapter doctrines in the chapter specific videos I'll be making, but to cover the basics, it seems like all the chapter doctrines coincide with one of the 3 generic doctrines. For example, the Ultramarines doctrine is active when your army is in the Tactical Doctrine, and the White Scars doctrine is active when your army is in the Assault Doctrine. And sometimes these doctrines can be strong enough to warrant building an entire army around them, and in some cases you may want to just stick to the doctrine that gives you access to your chapter doctrine for most of the game, depending on if your list is built around that doctrine. But again, I'll go more in depth about that when I make the chapter specific videos. But anyways, what I'm trying to get at here is that I think Space Marine players will have to learn which doctrines are going to be the best for them in any given matchup and in any given situation. So I think it adds a level of skill expression to the army, which I really like. That's enough about those new rules though. Let's now get into all the units that I think are standouts in the new codex when it comes to using them in any Space Marine chapter from this codex. Again, I will be doing chapter specific videos at a later date, so right now I'm going to be talking about these units with the perspective of putting them in any chapter from this book. If I do not mention a unit, this means that I personally don't think it will see much play in competitive at high levels. Keep that in mind, I say at high levels, because people can bring whatever army they want to a tournament, so you will see this stuff at tournaments, but will you see it at high levels? That's what I want to talk about. And the reason I don't think you'll see some of these units at high levels is because these units may cost too many points for what they do. Maybe it's too slow and it will be destroyed before it accomplishes anything, or it just doesn't fit in one of the roles that I talk about in my video, how to build a competitive army. So that's stuff like anti-infantry units, anti-tank units, screening units, and so on. So let's start with the HQs. I think the Captain, Lieutenant, Librarian, Phobos Librarian, Phobos Captain, and the Chaplain are the standouts. I chose most of these guys over their Primaris counterparts, either because they are cheaper points-wise so you can fit more stuff into your army, or they have better upgrades that are more useful in competitive play. For example, a regular captain can take a jump pack and a storm shield, so basically you can turn him into a smash captain as most of us know him as. With that said, the smash captain did get an increase in points since Thunderhammers for characters did go up in points in this codex, but with some combos you can do with Stratagems and Warlord Traits, I think the smash captain is still a decent option. This character is still better than a generic Primaris captain since he has the fly keyword, which means he can charge stuff like flyers, and it's easier for him to get up on terrain to fight stuff that's hiding up on terrain, and with the storm shield he's a bit more durable. The lieutenant is pretty much the same thing. He's cheaper, and since he offers the same rerolls as a Primaris version, why pay more for essentially the same thing? Same with the Librarian and the Chaplain. They give the same buffs as their Primaris counterparts, but for a cheaper price. The only 2 exceptions to this, in my opinion, would be the Phobos Captain and the Phobos Librarian. So let's talk about the Phobos Librarian and then talk about the Phobos Captain. For the Phobos Librarian, it's because he has access to 6 different spells that regular Librarians don't, and that's pretty much it. For the Phobos Captain, I think he might actually be the best candidate for upgrading to a Chapter Master to hang out with the bulk of your roaming Death Ball while giving full rerolls of hits. On top of that, his gun is actually really good and fits in with most gun lines that want to move up the board. He can help provide a bit of damage or even threaten characters since he can snipe with his damage 3 minus 2 AP gun. And his ability to deny enemy deep strikes within 12 inches of himself can come in handy since you can position your screening units like your scouts or infiltrators out front and to the sides of your roaming death ball, while the captain takes up the back and denies the melee deep strikes from behind while still giving rerolls to the stuff in front of him like your intercessors. And last but not least, we have the Chaplain. This unit is actually really good, and he definitely got a buff from his previous version, because he comes with these new abilities which are actually really good. Kind of like the Chaos counterpart, which is the Apostle, he now has new buffs that he can put on friendly units like spells, except they aren't spells. They're called litanies. So like spells, you generate a litany for your Chaplain at the beginning of the game after you see your opponent's army. So you can pick a litany that best helps you for that game. There's a litany that gives a friendly unit a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds. This would be great when going up against an army like Thousand Suns, whose main damage is through psychic spells and mortal wounds. There is another litany that gives +1 to wound and shooting for a friendly unit, essentially giving them the Chaos Space Marine stratagem Veterans of the Long War for free. There is another litany that gives +1 to hit when shooting instead of to wound, but to be honest, in the current meta, I still think the +1 to wound litany is better, even though it has to be at the nearest target. The reason for this is, in the current meta, there are a ton of horde armies, which means you need to clear a lot of chaff. Also, knights exist, and a melee knight can easily become the nearest target if you position correctly. So I think the +1 to wound can be incredibly beneficial in helping you clear up screening units, or even taking on bigger units later in the game, or early in the game if your opponent mispositions them. The +1 to hit is still very good though, but with the way rerolls work now in this codex, I think the +1 to hit really only outshines the +1 to wound litany in the flyer spam matchup. So in pretty much every other matchup, I'd rather have the +1 to wound litany to help deal with screens or knights getting into my lines. So like I was saying earlier, you're going to have to analyze your own list and its capabilities, your opponent's list, and then you're going to have to figure out for yourself which litany is going to help you the best in that game. And the last litany that I think is good gives +2 to charge ranges for all friendly chapter units within 6 inches. And it allows those units to pile in and consolidate 6 inches instead of only 3. This can be extremely strong with the right build. I can see an army like Black Templars or White Scars making great use of this, and other chapters making decent use of it as well. So when it comes to the +2 inches to charge ranges for all of the friendly chapter units within that aura, it's pretty obvious why that's good. It makes your charges easier. But don't underestimate the other part of this ability that makes your consolidates and pile-ins 6 inches instead of 3 inches. Because of this extra distance you're going to get, it'll be easier to be able to take hostages or pull other units into combat that you don't want shooting you on the following turn. And if you don't know what I mean when I say taking a hostage or conga lining your guys in order to pull in multiple units into combat that aren't good in combat, but you just don't want them shooting you on the following turn, I have a video called Tips and Tricks for Melee Armies which goes over all of these tactics, and I would recommend checking that video out after this one if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about. So yeah, chaplains are actually incredibly useful now, and I think you should be bringing at least one of these guys in your list when making a Space Marine list. For troops choices, I think Intercessors are still by far the best choice, followed by Scouts and Infiltrators, and I do actually think Tactical Marines may have a place now too. Intercessors are probably my favorite unit in the book. They have a ton of stratagems and combos they can make use of, and if you're choosing units for damage output, I think these are the go-to troops choice. I wouldn't take any Tactical Marines over Intercessors when it comes to damage, since Intercessors are far superior in pretty much every way, but Tacticals may have a place in some Space Marine armies, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the reason I feel that Intercessors are the go-to troops choice when it comes to damage is because they're actually pretty cheap for the amount of damage that they can put out. With the new bolter discipline rule, their bolt rifles are actually pretty deadly, especially combined with the tactical doctrine, and there's a bunch of cool stratagems that you can use on these guys to buff them up and really get them to output some damage. And like I said earlier, I wouldn't take Tactical Marines over Intercessors as like the main troop choice to do damage. I actually think Tacticals will work well as a screen now because they're cheap enough, so to be honest, you could make an argument for taking Tacticals over Scouts, but when it comes to the Intercessor versus Tactical Marine, I believe Intercessors just win out very easily. And this is because Intercessors are only 5 points more than a Tactical Marine, but they are double the wounds and double the attacks and have a natural -1 AP on their bolt rifles. I know earlier I said that for HQ choices, that taking the regular versions of the HQs was better than the Primaris versions, but that's because the benefits weren't as good. If you have a Captain and a Primaris Captain, you get 1 extra attack and 1 extra wound, and then also different war gear. Compare this to a 5-man Intercessor squad versus a tactical squad, you can get 5 extra wounds and 5 extra attacks for only slightly more points. You're literally doubling your stats for 5 points a model, whereas the Primaris characters are only a very slight upgrade from the regular characters. So again, in regards to damage output and durability, the Intercessors are just better. Moving on, the Scouts are still amazing because they are cheap and great for screening. They are your guardsmen essentially. You don't bring them for damage, you bring them to screen for the units in your army that do damage. With the decrease in points for tacticals though, it could possibly be viable to bring regular tactical squads as your screening unit over Scouts. Although personally, I still prefer the Scouts because of the way they can be deployed outside of your deployment zone, so it gives you more options. And against some armies, being able to deploy outside your deployment zone really helps against stuff like turn 1 deep strikes. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say a screening unit, I have a couple of videos you should check out after this one that will catch you up to speed. Those videos are my how to make a competitive army video and my deep strike denial video. I'll have a link to those videos in the description. With the Scouts though, the only good builds in my opinion is bare bones, so just bolters or bolters with 1 heavy bolter or missile launcher, but that's only if you have the spare points after finishing off your list and after adding all of the other units you want in your list. Because again, the Scouts are just your meat shield and they're pretty much just there to die essentially. The Infiltrators are basically your Scouts but on steroids. They do everything the Scouts do but better. Personally, I still think the Infiltrators should be a bit cheaper, but even for what they cost now, they're still decent. They come with a cool ability that doesn't allow your opponent to deep strike within 12 inches of them, meaning they can really screw over armies like Genestealer Cult, Blood Angels, and any other random units that want to charge from deep strike. So they are pretty good. And if you have the spare points to put them in the list, I would recommend bringing at least a couple of these units in lists as well, but if you can't afford them, then either take Tactical Marines or Scouts instead, which again, personally, I'm still all about the Scouts, mainly just because of their utility to be able to deploy outside of your deployment zone. The new unit called the Incursor Squad seems decent as well, but without enough testing and stuff on them, I'm not confident in saying that they are actually good. They can drop mines, which seems like it would be really good for board control, but they're also pretty damn expensive. And when trying to theory craft some lists, I just couldn't find room for them over Intercessors or Infiltrators. Let's go over elite choices now. For elites, I like the Apothecary, the Company Ancient, Company Veterans, the Invictus Dreadnought, and the Redemptor Dreadnought. The Apothecary got a nice buff by going down in points. And since I personally think that Space Marine lists going forward should be spamming the 2 wound Primaris models, I think that the Apothecary is a decent take, especially if you're trying to make a brigade detachment, since he's a cheap choice for one of your elite slots. And the Company Ancient because the Relic Banner is actually really good, although it was nerfed. The new version gives plus 3-inch range to the aura instead of plus 1 to the roll to see if a dead model shoots or attacks. But I actually kind of like this version better since you can fit a lot more models within the aura to make use of it. Also, from what I've seen in the 2 supplements, they have their own Relic Banners as well, and both are pretty good. So I assume every chapter will get their own Relic Banner, and I also assume that those will be pretty good as well. So I think Company Ancients are a really good pickup for Space Marine lists that are infantry centric. Also, like I mentioned earlier about HQs, take the regular versions of these guys instead of the Primaris to save points for some of the same reasons I mentioned earlier. Company Vets, I'm kind of iffy about, but chose to include them anyways. I think they are best with a Storm Shield plus Storm Bolter coming in with a drop pod or going up the board in a Rhino. But that means having to bring a drop pod or a Rhino, and when you do the math, Intercessors still put out more damage on average, when you combine all the Stratagems and everything you can do with them. But I mean, Company Veterans aren't bad by any means, and they are arguably more durable than the Intercessors because they can take Storm Shields. So I guess if you want damage plus survivability, then the Company Vets are the better choice if you're okay with spending points on transports. But other than that, I still think Intercessors would be your better anti-infantry option. For the Invictus Dreadnought, this guy can be pretty good. If you're playing in a mission where you know that you're going to auto go first unless the opponent seizes, you can bank on this and deploy them outside your deployment zone so that they can get easy turn 1 charges. If you bring 3 of these guys in this list, it's like a threat overload if you go first and you deploy them outside of your deployment and then make charges and get your flamers off and everything on turn 1. And that might actually be able to give you time to be able to get some transports up the board, or if you have other dreadnoughts in the back like a Redemptor or a Leviathan or stuff like that, your opponent will most likely be trying to deal with the stuff that's in their lines already, which will be like 3 Invictus Dreadnoughts versus shooting the guys that are in the back that are just going to be shooting for free essentially. So yeah, I think Invictus Dreadnoughts do have a place. With that said, if you do go second, these guys aren't as good, but they still can be good depending on the layout of the board, what terrain you have, because you could hide them behind a wall in like the middle of the board or something like that. But if you don't have somewhere to hide them in the middle of the board, then you're going to have to start them a little farther back or possibly even in your own deployment, because if your opponent has something like Smash Captains or melee threats that can just run up and one-shot these guys essentially, then you're not going to want to put them up there for free if you know your opponent is going to be going first. But this is one of those things that comes down to skill and game knowledge and just knowing whether or not you need to deploy aggressively or defensively. Either way though, I do think this unit is pretty good, especially because they're incredibly cheap for what they do, and they can fit into lists where they can become a threat overload with a ton of other things like I mentioned earlier. And for the Redemptor Dreadnought, it's pretty damn cheap for how much DACA it puts out, and there is a stratagem you can use to make it take less damage, which I'll talk about later when I go over the stratagems. So now let's go over the fast attack choices. We have scout bikes, attack bikes, and regular bikes, and that's pretty much it. The scout bikes can be really fast, and they come with shotguns for extra DACA, and their stratagem to do mortal wounds when they leave combat is also pretty nifty. It's situational, but I mean, it could help you. The regular bikes, I think they're decent as well because they're pretty much the same points as the scout bikes, but the scout bikes come with more DACA. So if it's basically, do you want more durability? Go with the regular bikes. Or do you want more damage? Go with the scout bikes. That's pretty much my thoughts on it. If you want to play back a little bit more though and play more defensively, then the regular bikes are definitely better than the scout bikes because they're still going to get their bolter discipline where they can rapid fire at 24-inch range because they do have the biker keyword. But if your army wants to get up close and personal with the enemy, then I think scout bikes are going to be your better option. And then when it comes to the attack bikes, the only purpose I see for these guys is filling out a cheap brigade. But even still, that does give them a use, so there you go. They're your tax units for filling out the 3 fast attack slots in a cheap brigade. And finally, we have heavy support. Devastator squads, Eliminator squads, Helblaster squads, Thunderfire cannons, Whirlwinds, and the Repulsor Executioner. Devastator squads are my personal go-to out of all of the heavy supports. With the combination of the Signum and the Cherub, the Ancient allowing them to possibly shoot when they die, and the Hellfire Shells and Flak Missile Stratagems, I really like these guys. The range on their weapons is pretty long, so you can camp the backfield and terrain to give them a 2+ save, and even when they die, you can possibly shoot with them again because of the Ancient. Eliminator squads are my go-to choice for backfield screening. They are pretty cheap with decent range guns, and their guns are pretty versatile and can help you out in a few different situations. So they give you options, and options are great and competitive since you'll often need them. Also, with the camo cloaks that they have, they're Primaris that are going to have a 2-up save, or technically a 1-up save against shooting, so that means they basically negate -1 AP, and they do better against -2 and -3 AP, so they're fairly durable, their guns can reach a long distance, and they're perfect for like screening out your backfield. Helblaster squads are pretty good as well. Combine them with an Ancient to shoot when they die, and also use a stratagem to make them more durable, which I'll talk about when I get to the stratagems. Personally though, I still take Devastator squads over Hellblasters every day of the week, but you could make a decent argument for Hellblasters, so I decided to include them. Also, the new Impulsor dedicated transport is pretty much, in my opinion, built to transport Hellblasters. So the main problem with Hellblasters is that they usually end up dying before they get in range to actually shoot the targets that they want to. But with the new Impulsor, you do have a delivery method for them to be able to get in range and shoot. So getting back to what I was talking about earlier, you could bring a list that has like 3 Invictus Dreadnoughts, plus a couple of 5-man Hellblaster squads inside of Impulsors, so that way your opponent has to decide whether they're going to shoot the Dreadnought or they're going to shoot the transports that have the Hellblasters, so that way something's going to end up getting in range to do exactly what they want to do. Thunderfire cannons are extremely good now, especially in our current meta. Not necessarily for its damage, but because of the stratagem Tremor Shells, which can slow down an enemy unit and can be combined with other stratagems, which I'll talk about later when I get to the stratagems. It can also shoot units that it can't see, which is great in ITC format to kill off those pesky mortars that are hiding on an objective inside of a ruin. Whirlwinds are good now as well. They are surprisingly cheap and basically the Space Marine Wyvern. You can take them to help deal with stuff like mortars hiding in a ruin or guardsmen camping an objective out of line of sight. And with a new stratagem, you can actually make this thing fire twice, so it's like having 2 Whirlwinds in your list. And the Repulsor Executioner got some okay buffs with some stratagems, so I decided to include it, although personally I'm still not entirely sold on it yet, but I can see potential in it. And the reason I'm not sold on it is because I still think that in the current meta it can die too easily and it costs a hell of a lot of points. That's basically my only problem with it. And last but not least, let's talk about the dedicated transports that I like. And those would be the Repulsor and the new Impulsor. Shocking, I know, I didn't mention drop pods. Personally, I still don't think drop pods are worth bringing. Not because of the drop pod itself or its rules, because when it comes to its rules, I think the drop pod is great. But drop pods can only transport regular Marines. They can't transport Primaris. And personally, I think regular Marines just aren't worth it really, especially if you're using them just for damage. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're bringing like regular tactical Marines, I think they should be on the board screening for you, basically like using them as if they're scout squads with a better save. Sure, the drop pod can deep strike turn 1, which is actually pretty cool, and sure it doesn't count towards units in deep strike when it comes to the points having to be on the board and in deep strike, but I mean, what are you going to put inside it? 10 tactical Marines? 10 Stern Guard? 10 company veterans? 10 Devastators? 3 of those units are subpar mathematically when compared to Intercessors because of the stratagems that the Intercessors have access to. And Devastator's best loadout, in my opinion, is 2 last cannons, a missile launcher, and a heavy bolter. And you don't really need to spend 65 points on a transport for that, since you can park them in the back of the board, which is usually outside of the range of most of the enemy's guns, and they can still be useful. You could make an argument about filling them with Devastators with the Grav Cannons, because Grav Cannons did get a buff in this book because of a stratagem that allows them to reroll their wounds. But personally, again, I still like the other loadout that I mentioned earlier and would rather go with that. With that said, you could still technically make an entire army deep strike with drop pods, because they do ignore the rules for tactical reserves or whatever it's called, but then you're spending like 600 to 700 points on transports, and you'll be playing a 2,000 point game with 14 to 1,300 models, and all of those models are going to be the regular Space Marines, which we all know still aren't necessarily the best when it comes to outputting damage. So in my opinion, a list like that isn't really going to cut it unless they can super alpha strike the opponent, and judging by the math that I've done, I don't think regular Marines and drop pods are going to put out the damage needed to kill some of the high level competitive armies. And also, fast armies like Genestealer Cult, Eldar, Tyranids, Orcs, Dark Eldar, all those armies can take up the entire board in one turn if given the opportunity. And if you don't believe me when I say that armies can do this, just imagine an Orc boy army advancing a couple units of 30 boys up the board, which can cover their entire half of the board, and then they can use the jump on another unit of 30 boys to then take up pretty much the rest of the area of the board, because you gotta remember, drop pods and the imprint that they're gonna have when they land is gonna be pretty big, especially considering that the units that get out also have to be outside of 9 inches from enemy models. So yes, there are armies that can take up the entire board on one turn. So because of things like that, and also because of the fact you can only take regular Marines in the drop pods, I'm not necessarily sold on them. With that said, in some of the supplements that go along with this codex, there could be some hidden gems in those that actually make drop pods more viable. But as it stands right now, based on just going off of the rules in the codex, I don't think drop pods will be seen that much in lists that do well at major events. And with that said, let's actually talk about the two transports that I do like. I like the Repulsor mainly because it comes with a bunch of guns, although personally, I wouldn't play it because I think it's too big of a target, and unless you go first, you're probably going to lose one or two of these things on turn 1. Against some armies, you could definitely lose one or two of these things on turn 1, and then you're kind of just like, you're out 600 points on turn 1, which isn't that great. But it is still a good unit, and I have seen it do well in competitive play, so I'm going to include it. And with the new Impulsor, I think this unit is actually really good, but really for only one purpose, and that's transporting Hellblasters. You can't put aggressors in here, which I would love to put aggressors into this transport. And I think Intercessors are just better foot slogging up the board instead of putting more points in towards transports for them. Especially because in most cases, you're going to want to keep your Intercessors in 10-man squads, which won't fit into these transports, because you're going to want to get the most when you use your stratagems like rapid fire or the auto-hitting auto bolt rifles. So pretty much this transport to me is just a Helblaster transport, but even still it's really good because you can have it move up the board and the Helblasters can get out and still shoot, which will mean they're most likely finally going to be in rapid fire range, because most of the time, at least when I've seen Helblasters used, they've never had a chance to rapid fire because they die before they end up getting in range, and because they'll be so far up the board, they'll usually be able to target the units that they actually want to target instead of just being glorified Intercessors clearing chaff. In some cases, I do think the upgrade to a 4+ invul on the Impulsor is worth it, but in most cases, I actually think I would just not take the invul and I would keep the transport relatively cheap. This is because if you have the right list and you have a good enough threat saturation, your opponent most likely isn't going to be shooting the Impulsors anyways until the Hellblasters get out, because they're going to be shooting at stuff like your Invictus Dreadnoughts or your Redemptor Dreadnoughts and stuff like that. If you aren't running any vehicles in your list and your list is entirely infantry and you have a couple Impulsors in your list though, then I can see an argument for giving them the 4+ invul, because they're definitely going to be the main target for your opponent's anti-tank ranged weapons. So in that case, then yes, I would give them the 4+ invul. And that's it for my thoughts on the units from the Codex and which ones I think will see the most play in high-level competitive games. Note that I didn't include any Forge World units because they're not in the Codex. But there are some units like the Whirlwind Scorpius that I think might actually see some play because of stratagems that Whirlwinds can use now, so the Whirlwind stratagems will actually apply to that. And to be honest, that's pretty much about it for the Forge World stuff. Maybe Leviathan Dreadnoughts, because you also have a new stratagem that will work well with Leviathan Dreadnoughts, or even Contemptors, or Derideos, so we might see them as well too. So now that I've gone through all of my thoughts on the different units that you can find throughout this book, let's now move to the stratagems, and after the stratagems, we will then go over the Warlord Traits, Relics, and Psychic Spells. Also, I'm going to skip over the chapter tactics for each chapter, since that's going to be covered more in depth in other videos I make for each individual chapter. Also, this video is getting pretty long compared to most of my videos, so I'd rather keep that information for other videos that are dedicated to those chapters. But if you want to know what the chapter's traits are, then I will have a link in the description to the Warhammer community post that showcases all of them. So for stratagems, I'm going to mention the ones that I think are the best and the ones that I think will be most used in competitive play. Armor of Contempt. This is great if you want a vehicle to tank up some smites. So pretty much an Invictus Dreadnought, since he's probably going to be up in front of most of your army anyways, trying to flame stuff to death and get in close combat. But other than that, I don't think you should do something like throwing a Leviathan Dreadnought in front of your whole army in order to eat up the smites just because you have access to this stratagem. If anything, you should be doing that with like a unit of Intercessors, because you should be bringing a Chaplain, and that Chaplain has a litany that gives that infantry unit a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds. So in cases like that, I would rather have like my infantry squad getting smited to death instead of my Leviathan Dreadnought, who's arguably going to put out more damage. There can be rare cases though where you would rather have your infantry than a vehicle that's in your army, so in that case then yes, you can sacrifice your vehicle for the greater good, use this stratagem and get him to eat up the smites. Or if you do have stuff like impulsors in your list, once the units get out of them, you can actually put the impulsor closer to the enemy characters that are going to be smiting you, and you can have that impulsor eat all the wounds, since once that impulsor transports the unit, its job's basically done anyways. So you can use it as a big meat shield, or I guess a big metal shield, in order to absorb all those smites. Auspex Scan. This stratagem allows you to pick an infantry unit to shoot at an enemy unit that has arrived on the table that turn within 12 inches of your infantry unit. You do have to shoot at a -1, but I mean, you can still shoot at them. So I don't think much really needs to be said about this stratagem. It can be incredibly good. And it will usually force opponents to either eat up all those shots and lose a couple of their charging guys, or when they deep strike in, come in outside of 12 inches from you, which means that they can't get a charge off. Suppression Fire. This stratagem allows a Whirlwind or a Thunderfire cannon to shoot for a second time, but it must be at a unit it cannot see. This restriction is fine because, more often than not, you're going to hide your Whirlwind or Thunderfire cannon behind terrain anyways, since this gun can shoot targets that it can't see. So more often than not, your unit isn't going to see anything anyways. This stratagem basically gives you a free Whirlwind or a free Thunderfire cannon as long as you already have one in your list. A 2-for-1 deal essentially. This stratagem can also be combined with another stratagem that I'm going to talk about later, which is Tremor Shells, and yeah, I'll go over that when we get there. Only in death does duty end. This stratagem allows a character to shoot or fight again when it dies. This is great with Smash Captains when fighting something like an Imperial Knight, and this new version doesn't have any restrictions other than having to be used on a character. This means that you can now use this stratagem on Guilliman. So definitely a buff and definitely pretty good. Chapter Master. For 2 command points, you can upgrade a captain to give full rerolls instead of just hit rolls of 1. If you're playing with only generic captains in your list, this is something that I think you should do every game, since it increases your army's hitting efficiency by a bunch because of the new way that the rerolls work in this book, which is that you can reroll any hit rolls, not just failed hit rolls. So that means when shooting at something that's -1 to hit, you can reroll your 1s, 2s, and 3s, whereas previously you would only be able to reroll your 1s and 2s since your 3s would technically count as hits before the modifiers. Honor the Chapter. So this stratagem allows you to pick a unit and it can fight again at the end of the phase, if it's in combat. So you can have stuff like Guilliman fight twice if you wanted, or a Redemptor Dreadnought, or a Smash Captain, or a unit of Intercessors. Literally anything with the Adeptus Astartes keyword can fight twice with this stratagem. Duty Eternal. This is the stratagem that I said buffed up Redemptors. Well, Redemptors and Forge World Dreads, but I didn't mention the Forge World Dreads because they aren't in the Codex. But this stratagem makes any damage your Dreadnought takes halved rounding up. So it makes your Dread more durable, which is nice. So your opponent will have to put more shots into them than normal in order to destroy it. Flak Missile. This stratagem is pretty much the same as before, only now it's worded differently so there's no arguments over it. You can have a missile launcher gain +1 to hit when shooting at a target with the fly keyword, and it does D3 mortal wounds instead of the normal damage. Really nice against anything that can fly. Veteran Intercessors. This stratagem was part of the Indomitus Crusader formation from Vigilus Defiant, but due to the recent FAQ that Games Workshop released, that formation stratagems are now useless, and you can only use the new replacement stratagems from this codex. With that said, the Indomitus Crusader formation isn't entirely useless. It does still have the Grey Shield Warlord trait, which can now benefit from any of the new and improved chapter tactics, so at least there is still that. And to be honest, I think with some builds, it could still be worth taking just for that Warlord trait alone. But anyways, you pay 1 command point to upgrade a 5-man unit of Intercessors, and 2 command points for a unit that contains 6 or more models. And that unit becomes Veterans, which means that they gain +1 leadership and +1 attack. This can be pretty good in the right chapter, since some chapters are actually going to be wanting to be focusing on close combat. It is more pricey now, but depending on your list, I think it could be worth it. Also note that other stratagems from the Indomitus Crusader formation are also in this codex, but they no longer have the requirement of only being able to be used on veteran intercessors, so upgrading to vets is literally only for the extra leadership and attack. So it can be worth using this stratagem if you have the right build that's meant for it, but to be honest, more often than not, I don't think this stratagem is really an auto-include like it used to be, because now you can use the other stratagems on any intercessor squad, not just veteran intercessors. So because of that, I think this stratagem is okay, but not like an auto-include. It really depends on your build. Bolt Storm. This is one of the stratagems that replaces one of the ones from the formation. This stratagem allows your intercessors wielding auto bolt rifles to auto hit like flamers if they are within half range of their target. This can be extremely good against stuff like Jim Vessel's Chaos list with Plague Bearers, since you can ignore their -2 to hit and just auto hit them. And then with that same unit, you can buff it up with the Feel No Pain later on, so inevitably when they get smited the next turn, they're going to eat up a bunch of smites. You'd use this stratagem first to kill as many models as you possibly can, hopefully killing at least 10, so that way they lose their -1 to hit from having more than 20 models in the unit, and then you can shoot the rest of your units at them, either at not -1 or -1 if they did get Miasma Pestilence off on them. But either way, it just clears the way to make the rest of your army more efficient at shooting that unit. Cluster Mines. This is a very situational stratagem, but it can be useful in those situations. It does D3 mortal wounds to a unit when a scout bike squad leaves combat with it. So again, it's nice, but it's super situational. Hellfire Shells. This stratagem allows a heavy bolter to do D3 mortal wounds instead of its normal damage. This is great against high toughness targets that heavy bolter would hardly damage normally. So stuff like Imperial Knights, Land Raiders, Custodes, stuff like that. Rapid Fire. This is another stratagem that was taken from the Indomitus Crusader formation. This stratagem makes the bolt rifles on Intercessor squads rapid fire too. So this means 4 shots for each model as long as they meet the requirements to rapid fire either through the normal rules or bolter discipline. This stratagem is incredibly good, probably my favorite in the Codex. This stratagem will also be stupidly good in Ultramarines, but I'll talk about that in the Ultramarines video. Relics of the Chapter. This stratagem allows you to add more relics to your army by spending command points. This stratagem was changed from its previous version, and it's no longer once per game. So, as of right now, you can spend as many CP as you want for that many extra relics. It's pretty nifty. Tremor Shells. This stratagem uses a Thunderfire cannon to slow down enemies and works extremely well against stuff like Tyranids, Orcs, and Chaos. You make a shooting attack with the Thunderfire cannon, and you -1 from your wound rolls. But if you do make a successful wound roll against that target unit halves its movement, advance, and charge distances until your next turn. Combine this with the stratagem I mentioned earlier that allows the Thunderfire cannon to shoot twice, and you can slow down 2 enemy units at once. Combine this again with a Wyvern from Imperial Guard using the artillery formation, and you can make pretty much 1 unit unmovable that turn, which is kind of funny. This can also be incredibly powerful against the right armies in the right situations. Against Jim Vessel style lists, you can slow down the entire army because it's all hiding behind 1 giant unit of Conga Line Plague Bearers, and against Tyranids, you can slow down like one of their Gene Stealer units so you're not getting rushed by multiple Gene Stealer units in 1 turn. And you can use it to slow units down when playing ITC missions if your opponent took Recon as one of their secondaries. So there are so many things you can do with this stratagem given the right situation, and it's the reason why I will now always include at least 1 Thunderfire cannon in my future Space Marine lists. Steady Advance. This stratagem allows you to pick an infantry squad and pretend it didn't move for the purposes of the bolter discipline rule, meaning you can still move in rapid fire with your bolt rifles. Combine this with the rapid fire stratagem on intercessors with bolt rifles for maximum devastation. Hero of the Chapter. This stratagem allows you to have 2 warlords pretty much. Once you have nominated a character to be your warlord, you can nominate another character to have a warlord trait for 1 command point. Pretty nifty and can create some cool combos. Transhuman Physiology. This stratagem is activated on any Adeptus Astartes unit that isn't a vehicle, and for that phase, they make all of the opponent's wound rolls of 1, 2, and 3 fail automatically, meaning if they shoot last cannons at your Hellblasters, they only wound on 4+. This can be very helpful, but honestly not game-breaking, except against a couple of armies, like Chaos Hellforged Deredeo spam that spams a bunch of Butcher Cannons. Against that army, this stratagem would be incredibly good. Tactical Flexibility. This stratagem allows you to combat squad a unit mid-game. Very situational, but can still be useful if you need to send the models in 2 different directions for some reason. Maybe to grab different objectives, maybe so they can count for recon, stuff like that. Adaptive Strategy. This stratagem allows you to go backwards with your combat doctrines. So like I explained earlier, you start in Devastator Doctrine, and then you have to change it to Tactical, and then from Tactical to Assault. And once you hit Assault, you're kind of stuck. But this stratagem goes backwards, so you can go from Assault to Tactical, and from Tactical to Devastator. So as far as I know, this is the only way to go backwards in your tactical doctrines. And that's it for the stratagems that I think will be very useful in competitive play. If I didn't mention a stratagem, it's either because it works with a unit that I don't think will see much competitive play, or because it's just not worth using, or it's so incredibly situational that it wasn't worth mentioning. So now let's go over Warlord traits, and to be honest, there's only 2 I like. With that said, each chapter will have their own chapter-specific Warlord traits to choose from, so I assume there will be more viable ones once we get those supplements. So the Warlord traits from the main Codex that I like are the Imperium's Sword. This is incredibly good on Smash Captains. It gives them strength 10 with an extra attack. Not much more really needs to be said, other than I think that this is really only good on Smash Captains. Champion of Humanity. This one is also incredibly good on Smash Captains. I'd take Imperium Sword over this in most cases, but with the stratagem that allows you to have multiple Warlord traits, this can be your second pickup if you're facing off against Imperial Knights and you have multiple Smash Captains. The reason I'm not mentioning Storm of Fire, because Storm of Fire isn't stackable with your combat doctrines. So because you're most likely going to be playing with combat doctrines, that Warlord trait isn't going to be that good. And if you're playing the army in Imperial Soup, you probably have other Warlord traits that are better anyways. With that said, if you are playing these Space Marines inside of an Imperial Soup list, you can use the Hero of the Chapter stratagem to give an extra Warlord trait to one of your Space Marine characters, and in that case, the Storm of Fire Warlord trait could be viable in my opinion. So now let's go over the relics. Also, by the way, if you're still watching this video after this much time, thank you very much, since the YouTube algorithm gods will praise me for it. So thank you very much, and I hope you're still enjoying the video. So for the relics, the ones that I like are the Armour Indomitus. This relic works on bikes now, so that's cool. But it just makes a character a bit more durable by giving them a 2+ save, and once per game they can activate a 3+ invulnerable save. Standard of the Emperor Ascended. I kind of talked about this earlier, but this relic was nerfed from the previous book. This relic now just increases the range of the Standard's aura by 3 inches, making it a 9-inch aura, which means you can fit more models into it. It also makes units in that aura fearless, which is also really good. Reliquary of Gathalamor. This relic can only be given to a Primaris model, so the Phobos Librarian. It creates an 18-inch bubble around that character, which causes enemy Psychers to suffer -1 to their spell casts. And if the enemy Psyker fails a spell cast within that range, then you roll a dice, and on a 4+, their Psyker suffers D3 mortal wounds. This could be brutal against certain armies like Eldar, Thousand Suns, or even Grey Knights. So in those matchups, I would take this relic 100% of the time if I had a Primaris character in my list. And that's it for the relics. I didn't mention the relics that I think aren't that good, and I also didn't mention any of the relics that upgrade weapons, just because they're obviously good. They upgrade weapons. So if you're bringing a character with a chainsword, then obviously Teeth of Terra is a good upgrade. And if you're bringing a character with a power sword, then obviously the Burning Blade is going to be a good upgrade as well. Although personally, I do think that the other relics that I mentioned are far better, and I would take them over the weapon upgrades every time, and I wouldn't force myself to bring like a character with a chainsword just so I can use Teeth of Terra. I would rather have Reliquary of Gathalamor or the Standard of Emperor Ascendant. And even though you can take as many relics as you have characters now, because you can spend command points for every relic, I wouldn't go overboard with it, because that's less command points you'll have for using actual stratagems in your game. And now, last but not least, we have the Psychic spells. Space Marines have 2 disciplines in their book, and then another discipline from their own chapter, for 18 spells altogether for each chapter. But in this book, there's only 12, so let's go over those. So we have the Librarius discipline and the Obscuration discipline. The Librarius discipline is for regular Librarians and Primaris Librarians, and the Obscuration discipline is for Phobos Librarians. The spells I like in the Librarius discipline are Veil of Time. This spell has 2 good uses. The first use is to pick a unit and get a rerollable charge, so that's pretty self-explanatory. The other use is to put it on a unit to allow it to fight first in combat even if it didn't charge. So if you have Guilliman or a squad of Intercessors stuck in combat, you can cast this on them to make them fight first, which is actually really handy. Might of Heroes. This spell buffs a single model to gain +1 attack, +1 strength, and +1 toughness. This is great on Guilliman, Smash Captains, and pretty much that's about it. It's still incredibly good though. Null Zone. This spell creates a 6-inch bubble around the Psyker where enemy units cannot take invulnerable saves. This is great in certain situations, but not amazing since it is pretty hard to cast, so it's not very reliable or consistent. But in certain situations against certain armies, I definitely think it's worth taking. It also has a second ability as well, which makes enemy Psykers have their tests rounding up, so that's pretty nifty as well. And then we have Psychic Fortress. This spell gives a 4+ Feel No Pain to a unit in the enemy Psychic phase, meaning you can put a big unit out in front to absorb all the smites, and then buff them with this spell so that they are actually durable against the smites. So this is really good against Thousand Sun smite spam, and it also makes the unit fearless too, so that's really cool. Personally though, I still kind of like the Litany version of this better, because that works at the beginning of the battle round, whereas this only works on your turn. So if you don't get first turn, then your opponent, if they're playing Thousand Suns, can possibly move up the board and get to smite you if you deployed too close to them. But with the Litany, you could just give them a 5+ Feel No Pain doesn't matter whose turn it is at the beginning of the battle round. On top of that, this spell can be denied by an enemy spellcaster, whereas the Litany cannot. It just goes off for free. So personally, I like the Litany better and would rather rely on that than this spell, although this spell is still incredibly good. You could make an argument for bringing both in a list, because if you don't go first, you give them the 5+ Feel No Pain, and if you do go first, you give them the 4+ Feel No Pain, and then give the 5+ Feel No Pain to another unit, so that way you have an even longer screen out front. But yeah, that's pretty much it. For the Obscuration discipline, we have Hallucination. This spell does a mortal wound to the target within 18 inches and subtracts 1 from that unit's leadership, and then forces your opponent to roll 2d6, and if the result of that roll is greater than the target's leadership, then that unit suffers -1 to hit until your next psychic phase. This has potential to do really good things, either making the enemy unit suffer -1 to hit, or it could possibly force your opponent into using a command point reroll so that they don't suffer the -1 to hit because they rolled too high. Either way, it can be pretty good. It's kind of situational. It's not like the most amazing spell, but I mean, it's still decent. Tenebrous Curse. This spell does pretty much exactly the same thing as Tremor Shell Stratagem. You can target one unit within 18 inches and have the distance of its movement, advance, and charge rolls. This can be stacked with Tremor Shell Stratagem to make a unit pretty much unmovable. It also does 1 mortal wound to the target. And finally, we have Temporal Corridor. This spell allows you to pick a Phobos unit and move it, but it must advance. And when it does advance, you roll 3d6 for that advance, making that unit move incredibly far. This can be good to set up some move blocking shenanigans with Infiltrators or grabbing an objective, or just getting the Psyker in range to cast another spell on a good target like Tenebrous Curse. And that's pretty much it for this video. I've gone over my thoughts on the Codex, all of the units, spells, relics, and warlord traits that it has to offer, and hopefully I was able to help some of you out when it comes to making your competitive army, or just knowing what to look out for when playing against the new Space Marines. Before you go though, don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and also if you like what I do here on the channel, then subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content like this. With that said, I am incredibly sorry about the delay of this video, but I wanted to make sure that I got it right and that the information that I gave was as accurate and helpful as possible, and I figured waiting for the FAQ to come out to clear some things up was the best option to take in order to achieve my goal. So hopefully the wait was worth it, and I hope you still enjoyed the video. Also, if you've been a fan for a while of this channel and you want to help support it even further, outside of watching my videos and liking them, then consider making a pledge on Patreon. Patreon is the main source of income for the channel, and it's what allows me to make the videos that I do, and play Warhammer as much as I do to keep up to date with everything. Well anyways, thanks to all of you for watching this video. If you made it this far, I really do appreciate it, and thanks to all my current patrons for helping support me and my channel. I love you guys and gals. So thanks again to all of you, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming.